In this video, we will be discussing two new Alteryx tools, the filter tool and the data cleansing tool. Both of these come from the preparation category of tools. So let's get started here. I've saved the workflow from last time, so we can keep going where we left off. So I saved a workflow. I titled it Running Workflow. This should look familiar to you from the last video. We have our input data tool. We grabbed our employee data from our desktop .csv file. It's sitting right here. And we browsed it to look at the data. Then we put a select tool on it. We changed some variable types. We renamed job time. Then we put a DateTime tool and converted the birth date from a string to a DateTime data type. And then we put another select tool and we got rid of our old birth date variable, put our new birth date variable in its place. So let's run this workflow. This should look familiar. The output should look familiar from last time. We have our data set here. Our birth date is in the correct format. We have our time on job variable, which we had changed up with the select tool. So this is where we left off. Let's introduce the data cleansing tool. So we're going to attach it here. Here are the options over here in the tool configuration. Here are the options that you have with the data cleansing tool. Removing null data. You can remove rows that are all null or columns that are all null. That's what that means. So if we look here at our data set, if row 1 was all null, there was a null in every column in row 1, then that data cleansing would remove that row. But if you just have a null value in one of the columns in a given row, that's not what you want to do. You don't want to hit remove null rows or remove null columns because it won't remove them, because it has to be all null. To do that, we will use the filter tool here next. So in our data set, we don't have any rows that are all null. Let's look at our variables here. We have ID is okay, gender is okay, birth date has a null value, at least one. Education has a null value. Job category is okay, salary is okay. Beginning salary has a null, time on job has a null somewhere in that column. Previous experience has a null, and minority has a null. So there's 6 variables with null values in at least one of their rows. Birth date, education, beginning salary, time on job, previous experience, and minority. We'll deal with the null values in a minute. But one thing we can do here, we can replace null values with 0 if it's a null value in a numeric field, in a variable that's of a numeric data type. We can replace that with 0. Or we could replace the null with a blank space if it's a variable that's a string data type. Sometimes it makes sense to replace nulls with blanks or zeros. Other times it makes sense to delete the null rows, the rows with a null. And then sometimes it makes sense just to keep them as null. So depending on your particular data set and what you need, you can change those things. So let's just have a look here, and you can remove unwanted characters on a given variable. So up here you select the variables you want to cleanse. By default, all of them are selected. Let's just see what happens if we, I know for a fact we don't have any unwanted characters in our data. So that's not going to do anything checking these. But let's just leave these 2 boxes checked just to see what would happen. So we're going to replace nulls with blanks if it's a string data type. We're going to replace nulls with 0 if it's a numeric data type. So that means, for example, birth date is neither string nor numeric. It's a DateTime data type. So the null value in that column, which is on row 470, that won't be replaced with a blank or a 0. Education is a numeric variable. It has a double data type. If we go back and look, we've changed education to double here. So, yeah, and you can see it here as well. So the null value in this column will be replaced with a 0. And the null value occurs on row, well, not exactly sure, but it would replace the null. We know there's at least one null because I think I saw it. There it was. Row 131. We know there's a null because it says null right there. And then those string variables, the null values would be replaced with a blank space. So beginning salary is a string variable. And there's a null right here on row 17. That would become a blank space. So let's hit run and look at the output from our data cleanse. Notice the birth date field, since it's neither numeric nor string data type, the null in that field is not replaced with anything. The education field is a numeric data type. The null that occurs at row, I believe we said what, 131, should be replaced with a 0. And you see that right there. And then beginning salary is a string variable, and the null that occurs on that variable, which we know one occurred on row 17, is replaced with a blank. So you can see the data cleanse in action here. And there are other null values on these other variables, and those would be replaced with either a 0 or a blank, depending on if the variable is string or numeric. All right, let's undo what we don't want to do that, so let's uncheck those. One thing we do want to do to our data, if you look here, gender, the gender variable, it's either male or female, and they're lowercase, but we'd rather it be capitalized. Capital M for male, capital F for female. So you can do that with the data cleansing tool. If you go down here, modify case, we want to modify the case, we want to make it uppercase, and we only want to select the gender variable. So let's hit none, that unselects everything, and then just choose gender. And that's the only thing we really, for our particular data set, that's the only way we want to cleanse the data. So I'm going to hit run here, and if you look at the output, gender is now capitalized. And we had unchecked those replace null boxes. So they're back to being null. Like beginning salary, if you look at row 17, instead of being blank, it's null. All right, so that's the data cleanse tool. Next, let's look at the filter tool. So bring the filter tool over here. Let's filter our data. With the filter tool, you can see the tool configuration here. You can do a basic filter or a custom filter. If you do a basic filter, you're only allowed to filter the data on one column or on one field. If you do a custom filter, you can filter the data on as many fields as you want simultaneously. The output of the filter is going to be a subset of the original data. The part of the data that satisfies the filter, satisfies the true condition of the filter, will be output to this node, and the part of the original data that satisfies the false condition of the filter will be output to this node. So let's just do a simple one. gonna always check the custom filter box, even if I'm doing a filter on one column, just because I'm used to doing that. Let's take our data, which is here, and let's suppose we just want to filter the data by gender. We want the male, any of these people who are males to be in one data set and the females to be in another data set. So we would come over here, custom filter, and now you have these 4 things. This is a function, and there are lots of functions in Alteryx, and you're going to have to learn some of them. By no means will you have to learn all of them. You'll learn a couple today. This function you can apply to, the second thing here, are the fields or the columns or the variables. You can apply the function to one or multiple variables. And it does it on a row by row basis. If you have an expression, or if you've filtered before and you have a recent filter, you can find it here instead of typing. Suppose you type some long thing out, it would be here in your recents, and you can just pull it right straight from there. So that's what this is. And then if you do a filter commonly, and it's the same filter you always do for all of your data, you can save the filter, you can save the expression, and you can pull it up from your saved expression, so you don't have to type it again. All right, we want to filter the data by gender. Males in one data set, females in another. So we would just select our variable, gender. You can select it from here, or you can type in here left bracket. All variables in Alteryx are surrounded by 2 brackets. So if you type left bracket, it pulls up your variables, and you can just select gender. So if gender equals male, so gender is a string variable, so you have to put quotations around string variables. If gender equals male, then that's going to be the true portion of our filter, and the false will be anything that doesn't satisfy this condition. They're mutually exclusive. That's how this works logically. Whatever you type here, that's the true, and that gets output. So the subset of this data that satisfies this condition gets output to the true node of your filter. The subset of this data that does not satisfy this condition gets output to the false node of your filter. So let's run. If we look at our filter, here are the 2 nodes. True. So there were 258 of the original 474 people that were males, and there they are. And there were 216 of the original 474 that were females. And you can see the false portion and the true portion. All right, let's change our filter a little bit. This filter tool is very powerful. So one basic thing to point out is you can do one condition and then take, say, the true portion if you're only interested in the males or you're only interested in the females. Say you're interested in only the females, you could take the female output, and you could filter just this subset of the data further by attaching another filter to the false part, and then you can filter the false part of the data with another expression. So this is what is known as essentially, well, it's just I made up the term sequential filtering, where you just do one filter per one expression per filter tool, and you just add more filter tools to do more filters. Or you could just use one filter tool and do a multi, and you could have all the expressions right here in your box. I would recommend doing it that way because it makes your workflow easier to follow. It's not so convoluted because you have all these filter tools. So say you want to filter on multiple conditions, I wouldn't do multiple filters. I would just do one filter and type your multiple conditions in here. But you could do multiple filters. We could filter the data by male, female, and then the female portion we could go and filter this further. We could grab the people in the female data set that have a birth date 1930 or thereafter, or have an education level of high school or less. We could do that. But let's not do this sequential filtering. Let's just do it all in one. Let's change our filter. Suppose we don't want to filter on male, female. What I want to do is I want to filter the data sort of three layers. I want to grab, say I'm interested in the subset of the data that are a minority, so that's where this variable equals 1, that not only are they a minority, but that have only up to a high school education. So that's where this variable is between 0 and 12. This variable, again, is the number of years of education. 12 means through high school. Anything past 12 is post-secondary or college. And so I'm interested in those individuals in this data set, that are a minority. So where this variable equals 1, that have less than a college education, so between 0 and 12 years of education, and say that are born in the 1950s, so between 1950 and 1960, not including 1960. So that's the subset of the data that I'm interested in. So we could filter it. So our expression then, well, let's grab, we know one way we're filtering it is they need to be a minority, so minority needs to equal 1. And then we write the word and. So this means that any row in this data set that satisfies this condition is going to be kept, or it's going to be output to the true node, and any row that does not satisfy this condition will be output to the false node. So they're a minority, and education is less than or equal to 12. Both minority and education are numeric variables. They're doubles. So you don't have to put quotes around these 1 and this 12. They're not strings. Only quotes go around strings or date time variables. And the final condition is that they were born in the 1950s. So what we need to do is we need to grab the year portion of the date. And to do that, you use one of these functions here. It's in the DateTime portion. You're going to use the DateTime Format function. And so the DateTime format of the birth date, and we want to just grab the year from this birth date. And to do that, we put parentheses, capital Y. Well, first we put quotes, then parentheses, then percentage sign, then capital Y, then end quotes. Like this. So this function right here works on the birth date variable. And how does so this function, DateTime Format, accepts as an input the birth date variable. So whatever's in this row here, it accepts this as an input. And what does it do to this? It just grabs the year and it outputs the year. So we want minorities with less than or equal to 12 years of education who were born in the 1950s. So that means that this thing needs to be less than or equal to, less than, or let's say this, greater than or equal to 1950, and and the same thing less than 1960. So that gets it between 1950 and 1960, not including 1960. So do you see how this expression here will only keep those rows where the minority is equal to 1, education is less than or equal to 12, and the year part of their birth date is between 1950 and 1959 inclusive. You might wonder, where does this percent, this part right here, how did I know that? You need to learn some of these functions in Alteryx, and so the best way to learn is you would go to just Google and you would type in DateTime Format Alteryx and read the help documentation. And it gives you very detailed information about these specifiers. And if you look here, this returns the 4-digit year. Lowercase y returns the 2-digit year. That's how I knew that. You can put other things. You could put this, the W, and this will give you the week number. What week number out of that year was this date on? So there are different things you can input here, but this will do what we want. So then we're going to hit run. Only 11 records were true, 463 were false. So we want the true portion. So here are all the rows in our original data set where the individual, each row is a different person, right? Where the individual is a minority. They have less than or equal to 12 years of education, and they were born in the 1950s. There shouldn't be any row in this true portion that was born outside of the 1950s, has more than 12 years of education, and isn't a minority, or isn't a minority. All three of these conditions have to be satisfied to be put in the true node. And then we could further analyze this data set. Or we could look at the false node. The false node obviously has all those individuals who were either born outside of the 50s, or had more than 12 years of education, or weren't a minority. There's a little logic in here. Understanding logic is important when you're doing Alteryx programming. So try to, as a matter of practice, use if you're going to filter the data and you want a subset of the data, just try to write your filter once. Don't do a filter on one column and then bring in another filter tool and filter on another column. And you can do that, and if that's the way at first when you're learning, if that helps you see what's going on in the data, that's fine. But it does make your workflow rather cumbersome because you have all these extra tools that you don't necessarily need. This is the most efficient way. And that concludes this video.